Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex, and today I'm going to be giving a full, uncensored, irritated review of The Terror by Dan Simmons. This review will be spoiler-free for as much as a review can be spoiler-free, in case you are still interested at the end in reading The Terror. On the front of the book is a quote from Entertainment Weekly that says, "A masterfully chilling work, brutal, relentless, yet oddly uplifting." I don't know what uplifting meant to that person, but it certainly wasn't based off of the dictionary. Delusion, perhaps. I'm not sure that anybody from Entertainment Weekly actually read The Terror, because this has to be one of the most depressing, long-winded, and repetitive books that I've ever had the mispleasure of picking up. Truly grueling, and at certain points I wasn't even sure that I was going to get through this, but by my own stubborn perseverance. And I was stubborn. For Dan Simmons, more is less, so he just kept adding, and for whatever reason, his spineless editor didn't tell him to cut some of that shit out. I understand that he has widely acclaimed success from his Hugo Award winning novel Hyperion. Yes, this is that Dan Simmons. I didn't realize it either when I first started reading this book. But that doesn't mean that every word that he vomits onto a page is gold, and it's up to an editor to tell him that. Personally, I think editors should stand up to their authors more, especially those authors who have had acclaim of some kind, because it seems like after an author reaches a certain level of status, they can get pretty much anything they want published, regardless of whether or not it's good. Also, what genre is this book? I've heard that it's horror, that it's historical fantasy. In my opinion, the fantasy elements are so far between in some cases that entire sections of this book are frankly just historical fiction. I certainly was not scared at any point, and I definitely was not feeling the magic. Obviously, everything about this review is my opinion, but I felt that the historical fiction elements, when they were just straight historical fiction, were the most compelling parts of the story. I'm not really sure why it needed to have a supernatural element at all. The realistic starvation, illness, and cold were horrifying enough on their own without needing to add some sort of evil entity that was stalking them out on the ice. And that was my biggest issue with this book. I have a lot of issues with this book, but that's one of the largest. I wished that Dan Simmons had just picked a lane and gone with it, but it seemed like he couldn't do that. He was trying to get the best of both worlds and only managed to suck at each. This story was entirely too long, just 766 pages of misery. I'll say that this is a good book to read in the winter months because you'll feel chilled to the bone and exacerbate your seasonal depression. It's sad that I could see where this book could have gone. There were these glimpses of spontaneity and thrill that would appear briefly and then immediately get buried in more crap. I'm not supposed to be bored during a horror novel. And yet I was, and often. In a story such as this, there have to be moments, if not for the characters, then for the reader, where we can get moments of levity, where something positive is happening, and engagement between characters. Just to provide some sort of break for us so that the entire book isn't just depressing and horrible. But unfortunately, even when Simmons attempts to do that, his writing is so dry that it just makes no difference whatsoever. Adding to that, a crew of 125 men, and we get introductions to many of them just front-loaded in the beginning of the story, makes it difficult to parse out who's important and who very much isn't. And I mean that when I say there are so many names that you feel like you're going to need to remember or later on are going to become important, and you're like, who is that again? I don't remember that person. Where were they in the ranking? It was too much. It was entirely too much for this story. Did Dan Simmons do a ton of research into Arctic expeditions and the Franklin expedition specifically? Oh yes. To his credit, he really did, and because of that, you are going to get a description, whether you like it or not, of every square inch of the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus. You'll know the rigging, the cabins, the compartments, the general construction of the ship, like literally what it's made out of, how it was built, work rotations, what's in the captain's private stock, clothing requirements. You are going to hear so much about clothing that it is not even funny, and much, much more detail even than that, to the point where it's actually kind of impressive how much detail there is, but it's laid out in such a way that it reminded me of Neil Stephenson a bit when I read Seven Eves, and that is not a compliment. There comes a point when writing a book where there's this delicate balance between including details that are important for the story and really helps to set the scene for the reader, and then there's just showing off how much you possibly can cram into one novel. And I very much think that the details about these ships falls into the second category. This book actually would have benefited from a ship map of some kind, like what we got from The Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton. At the very beginning of the book, shows you the entire layout of the ship, and I think that that would have been a great addition to this book, and I'm kind of surprised that they didn't put that in here. And some of these details we are told repetitively so many times that it felt like it lost all value by the end of the story. On a completely separate topic, how many times would you like to read the word sodomite? Or get racist descriptions of the Inuit people? Or hear about how women are whores and snakes and stupid and just generally bad luck? Well, this book is full of that, and please spare me the people who will want to write in the comments, well, he was just expressing the sentiment of the times and life was just like that back then. Okay, but how fine of a point does an author need to put on it before continuously bringing it up becomes uncomfortable? And I want to be very clear, it is entirely possible for an author to write a bigoted character without the author themselves being a bigot. It's actually a really important way for us as readers to explore bigotry, is to see characters that exhibit those traits and have some sort of narrative that explains why that is wrong. There's the path where you have a character with distasteful or outdated views and you put them as the villain, the antagonist of the story, to show that those opinions are not correct. Or you can have our main character have some of those beliefs, and then over the course of the story they grow as a person and recognize that maybe they shouldn't think that way anymore. But the problem with this book is that our main character is a bigot and shows no personal growth or development by the end of the book, to the point where I genuinely want to ask Simmons why he bothered to incorporate those aspects into this story if he wasn't going to use them to say anything. To make it a period piece? I don't want to read stories like that, and I don't want to listen to people telling me that, well, it's realistic. And if you're somebody who would write that in my comments, I would encourage you to reflect on whether any of those sentiments are things that you agreed with, and if they are, which ones? Did I care about these characters outside of empathetically not wanting another human being to suffer? Not really. Almost all of the characters outside of maybe 2 or 3 I could not have cared less about. Atmosphere, which is the main thing that fans of this book talk about, is probably the only thing that The Terror has going for it. And if you are a fan of this book, great. Just because it had many elements that I found lacking doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it. Maybe you even agree with some of the points that I brought up in this review, but for you the atmosphere was so compelling that you didn't mind where it fell short. And that's cool, but it would be impossible for me to ever agree with somebody that says that this book is perfect. I was pleased as the chapters started getting shorter closer to the end of the book, but the trade-off for that was I then got character perspectives that I didn't care about. This story is painfully slow and paced in such a way that I think the point was for us to really understand these characters and to get to know their motivations individually. The beast out on the ice, however, remember that there's a beast that's been following them and giving them problems? Yeah, that's only important for certain parts of the book, and the rest of the time you can just pretend that it doesn't exist. The beast really is an afterthought, which is, again, why I don't think that it needed to be included in the first place. If you were curious which characters I found to be the most compelling in this story, they were definitely Dr. Goodsir, who actually did get a character perspective all his own, and Lady Silence, who did not. So she was the most mysterious part of the book outside of the monster itself, and I thought that her character was pretty cool, even though I don't think that she was treated well or talked about in any positive way nearly as much as she should have been. The unceremonious info dump that we get about the monster and its motivations and where it came from and how it's tied to Inuit mythology was so dry. Parts of the mythos that Simmons includes are actual Inuit legends, but a lot of it is just stuff that Simmons added himself. And I am not an Inuit person, so I can't tell you if the way that he molded the mythology to suit his purposes was done in a respectful way, but I feel like, based off of the way that he talks about the Inuit people throughout this entire book, it's probably not. One woman, very briefly described, only had the significance of possessing big tits to the point where that was actually her name. Super respectful. Is this the most terrible book I've ever read? No, but only because I actually finished it. See, for me, the most terrible books I've ever read are those that were so bad I couldn't finish them. So my DNF pile, to me, those are the worst books, which some people would say that that's not fair because I didn't get to the end of the story, so how can I truly judge it? And I would say if I gave up on it, it's probably pretty bad because I didn't give up on this and I hated this. The fact that I had times where I questioned whether I should even finish this tells you that it was pretty terrible. I have struggled with what to rate this because some very brief parts are genuinely good, but they're few and far between. I wouldn't say that the premise of the story necessarily was bad, but Simmons should not have been the one to tell it. Way too boring, just so fucking boring. I would never recommend this book. I will be getting rid of it, and I have decided that my final rating for this is 1.5 stars. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe if you feel like it. Let me know down in the comments if you also read The Terror, or even after this review if you're still interested in reading it. And leave me a little polar bear emoji if you made it this far in the video so I know who the real ones are. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.